The War of 1812 had dragged on longer than anyone in the United States had expected. What began as a conflict over trade restrictions, naval impressment, and national pride had turned into a grinding struggle against the most powerful empire in the world. By late 1814, Britain had defeated Napoleon in Europe and could finally turn its full attention to North America. American ports were blockaded, Washington had been burned, and morale was fragile. Yet far from the capital, along the muddy edges of the Mississippi River, a decisive confrontation was quietly taking shape. New Orleans, a young and unruly city, stood in the path of a British invasion that aimed to strike at the very heart of American commerce and control of the interior. New Orleans was more than just another port. It was the gateway to the Mississippi River, the lifeline of the American frontier. Whoever controlled the city controlled trade for vast territories stretching from the Ohio Valley to the Gulf of Mexico. Britain understood this well. If New Orleans fell, the United States would be cut in half economically, and British influence in North America would be permanently strengthened. For the Americans, losing the city would have been a national catastrophe, possibly forcing the young republic to accept humiliating peace terms. As 1814 drew to a close, the situation was paradoxical. Diplomats from both nations were already negotiating peace in Ghent, in what is now Belgium. Unknown to the soldiers and sailors preparing for battle, the Treaty of Ghent had been signed on December 24, 1814. But news traveled slowly across the Atlantic, and even more slowly through the American frontier. The armies gathering near New Orleans had no idea the war was technically over. Orders had been given, fleets were in motion, and neither side intended to stop. The British expedition was formidable. Veterans of the Napoleonic Wars filled its ranks, men who had fought across Europe and defeated France's best armies. The days following the first clash on December 23 were filled with tension, missteps, and quiet determination on both sides. After pulling back to the Rodriguez Canal, Andrew Jackson focused entirely on turning his defensive line into an unbreakable barrier. The canal itself was little more than a drainage ditch, but with enough labor and urgency, it became a serious obstacle. Soldiers shoveled mud day and night, piling earth into a thick rampart. The cold winter air mixed with damp swamp water, leaving men exhausted, soaked, and covered in grime. Yet morale steadily improved. Every hour that passed strengthened the American position. Jackson carefully placed his artillery. Heavy guns were mounted to command the open fields in front of the line, especially the approaches the British would most likely use. Smaller cannons filled gaps, while sharpshooters were positioned to pick off officers and artillery crews. The Mississippi River flank was protected by batteries that could rake enemy boats attempting to move upstream. On the far end, the swamp provided a natural wall no army could cross. Jackson understood that this narrow corridor was the only realistic path for a British assault, and he intended to make it deadly. Inside New Orleans, life had changed dramatically. Martial law remained in effect. Civilians were ordered to help with defenses or leave the city. Rumors spread daily, some claiming the British were days away from victory, others insisting Jackson had an unbeatable plan. Free black soldiers trained and drilled, proving their discipline and courage despite lingering prejudice. Lafitte's former pirates handled cannons with expert skill, their experience at sea translating well to artillery warfare. What had begun as a disorganized defense was turning into a united force. The British command faced a very different reality than expected. Major General Sir Edward Pakenham, who arrived to take overall command, was a respected officer and brother-in-law to Th. As dawn approached on January 8, 1815, a thick fog lay over the fields south of New Orleans. Visibility was poor, and sound carried strangely through the damp air. For Andrew Jackson, the fog was a blessing. It concealed the exact strength of his line and delayed the enemy's advance. His men stood quietly behind the rampart, muskets loaded, artillery primed, eyes fixed on the open ground in front of them. Every man knew that once the fog lifted, there would be no turning back. On the British side, confusion had already begun to creep in. The carefully planned assault depended on precise timing and coordination, but delays plagued the operation from the start. units struggled to move into position through mud and darkness. The detachment assigned to carry ladders and fascines arrived late, and some equipment was misplaced entirely. Officers attempted to reorganize under pressure, but the clock was already working against them. As the fog slowly thinned, British lines emerged from the grey mist. Rows of red-coated soldiers began advancing across the open field toward the American position. Drums beat steadily, and flags waved above the formations. It was a classic European-style assault, disciplined and bold. From a distance, it looked impressive. But the terrain offered no cover. Every step brought the attackers closer to a fortified line bristling with guns. Jackson waited. He had given strict orders not to fire until the enemy was well within range. His goal was maximum destruction with minimal waste of ammunition. When the British reached a critical distance, the silence shattered. American artillery erupted in a deafening roar. Cannon fire tore through the advancing ranks, cutting down entire files at once. Grapeshot and canister turned the open field into a killing ground. Musket fire followed almost immediately. American riflemen, many of them experienced hunters, fired with deadly accuracy. Officers fell, standard-bearers collapsed, and formations began to break. When the guns finally fell silent on the morning of January 8, 1815, a strange calm settled over the battlefield. The British Army, stunned by the scale of its defeat, withdrew to its camps in disbelief. Wounded men were carried away, officers counted losses, and the confidence that had once driven the invasion evaporated almost overnight. For the Americans behind the rampart, exhaustion mixed with relief. They had held their ground, defended New Orleans, and achieved a victory few had believed possible. Andrew Jackson did not allow celebration to turn into carelessness. He kept his forces alert, expecting another British attempt. Patrols were sent out, artillery remained loaded, and the defensive line stayed fully manned. But the British had no appetite for further fighting. Their leadership was shattered, their losses devastating, and their objective now clearly out of reach. Within days, they began preparations to leave Louisiana altogether. As the British fleet pulled back toward the Gulf of Mexico, news slowly filtered through the region that changed everything. Reports arrived that a peace treaty had been signed weeks earlier in Europe. At first, many refused to believe it. The idea that such a massive battle had been fought after the war had officially ended seemed unreal. But confirmation followed. The Treaty of Ghent, signed on December 24, 1814, had ended the War of 1812. The Battle of New Orleans had taken place in a legal and diplomatic vacuum, yet its consequences were very real. For the United States, the victory transformed the meaning of the war. The Treaty of Ghent itself settled little. It restored pre-war boundaries and resolved none of the original causes of the conflict. Without a clear military triumph, the war might have been remembered as inconclusive or even embarrassing. New Orleans changed that narrative. Americans now saw the war as a successful defense of national honor and independence. The young republic had stood up to Britain and won.